Well, should go good news for Armagh. Welcome to this podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And we are delighted to have Dr. David Glass on the programme today. He is a senior lecturer in computer science at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, where he is part of the Artificial Intelligence Research Group. He has received his BSc in mathematics, an MA in philosophy, and PhD in theoretical physics from Queen's University in Belfast. His current research lies in the intersection of computer science, mathematics, and philosophy of science, and he has published many papers on this area. Now, he's also carried out research on the relationship between science and belief in God, and has given many academic and popular talks on various aspects on this topic. He's the author of his this book, Atheism's New Clothes, and my kind of rule is if it's able to stand up, it's advertised. There we go. It's able to stand up. So this is David's book, and he also runs a website called saintsandskeptics.org, and he runs that in Vail. Mr. Vail, isn't it?
Vail, that's right.
That's right. And also David is a native of Armagh, which is brilliant. So David, thank you so much for coming on. We really do appreciate you taking the time to come on and to talk to us today.
Delighted to be able to join you. Thanks very much for having me on. Great to be part of your podcast.
It's good to hear an Irish accent. I'm just going to say that. A lot of the boys I've been talking to of Australian or German, it's good to hear an Irish accent. It's great. Brilliant. So David, how did you get interested in, we're going to talk about faith and what that means and science and all that kind of stuff. How did you get interested even into physics and philosophy and mathematics and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks, John. As I said, it's great to be part of this. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss some of this today, and for having me on. I suppose it starts going back to when I grew up down in your neck of the woods there in Armagh. So growing up in County Armagh and going to school in Armagh and all the rest of it, and growing up in a Christian environment, going along to church and kind of knowing what Christianity was about and becoming a Christian when I was young myself. But also, I suppose, in my late teens, beginning to sort of think about how all of this fitted together. I suppose for a long time, I was getting on with my studies, but I was, also had my Christian faith, but didn't maybe think that much about the connection between the two of them. But I suppose in my later teens, I started to think, well, how does all of this fit together? Or maybe even does it all fit together? And I wouldn't say I had huge big doubts or anything like that, but I did kind of want to understand more about this and how to deal with some of these questions and how to think about my faith properly. So I suppose it was when I went to university then. My interest always had been sort of maths and physics when I was at school. Maybe that's just what I was good at. I suppose maybe my interest was more in playing sport, to be honest. But
what did you play?
Well, I tried to play a bit of football and a bit of rugby. I wouldn't say I was great at either of them, but I enjoyed it. It was when I suppose I then went to university that I was getting more of these questions. And I suppose part of it for me was, well, how do I explain my faith to other people? I mean, it wasn't just a question for my own faith, although that was part of it. But if other people didn't share these beliefs, well, how could I explain them? Was it reasonable? Did it make sense? Did it fit with science and all the rest of it? So I started asking these questions, and when I was at university then, some people started to point me in the direction of some fantastic literature and started off reading people like C.S. Lewis and all. But then coming on to some more recent Christian writers who were writing about science, writing about reasons for belief in God and so on. And this just opened up a whole new world to me.
Who would you recommend to read? Particularly the more like C.S. Lewis, brilliant. Mere Christianity, an awesome start. Who would you recommend to read? Just even the modern boys you're talking about.
Well, I mean, there's so much material. I mean, I suppose first of all I should start off with another Armagh man, of course, with John Lennox. Right. I mean, John has written some great stuff on science and belief in God. So he's a lot of very helpful material. When I was at that stage at university, there were a few figures in particular, I suppose, I came across who really shaped my thinking at the time. People like Richard Swinburne, who was a Christian philosopher, John Polkinghorne, who was writing about science and faith in particular, William Lane Craig, who was writing about arguments for belief in God, and he's presented some very powerful arguments, some of those based on science, but also for specifically Christian beliefs and so on. And then I suppose also thinking about the more biblical side of things, well, Craig would have done that to some extent, but somebody like N.T. Wright, I suppose, was a big influence there as well. And I suppose one of the things for me was just looking at some of that material back then, it really helped me to see that actually not only was there not the kind of conflict that some people thought there was, but really there were very good reasons for Christian belief. And so this, as I say, opened up a whole new world to me. I suppose, but more, I mean, some of those guys go into a lot of detail on different stuff, whereas some other books, especially work by somebody like Tim Keller, for example, I think is he maybe conveys some of that scholarship at a more accessible level. So I think some of his material is really helpful as well.
His book, The Reason for God, was very...
That's
very
right.
helpful.
The Reason for God is a really good and helpful book, I would say. Yeah.
Very good. So why the title? Title's interesting of your book, Atheism's New Clothes, exploring and exposing the claims of the new atheists. Why the title?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Well, this goes back to the so-called new atheism. So around about 2006, I think it was, there were a number of books by people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, all really attacking religious belief, and their focus was mostly on Christian belief. And at the heart of this, I mean, there were a number of things. One being that faith was irrational, but also science was playing a big part in this. That science had somehow destroyed any kind of credibility to belief in God. So this was all in the context of the new atheism. Now, the new clothes bit. It's of course the story of the emperor's new clothes. So, you remember the story. You've got these swindlers who come along and they offer to make the emperor this magnificent new garment, but it's invisible to anybody who's unintelligent, you see. And so, of course, everybody goes along with this, right? The poor emperor is running around with nothing on him, and all these people go along talking about these magnificent clothes until this little boy comes along and points out, but the emperor's not wearing any clothes. Now, this is what some of the new atheists said about belief in God, about theology, for example, that it was like the emperor's new clothes. And somebody like Richard Dawkins was like the little boy coming along, the only one prepared to tell the truth and to say, the emperor of theology has no clothes. Now, actually, it struck me at the time that almost exactly the opposite was the case. When you started looking at the arguments that Dawkins and the other new atheists were putting forward, actually, it seemed to me that this new atheism was more like the emperor. So that's where the title Atheism's New Clothes came from.
Very good, very good. Well, it's a brilliant book, I will say, and it's a really helpful resource for anyone out there thinking through the different levels of evidence, thinking through what faith is. It's very helpful. So I do recommend it heartily out there. So we're going to talk a wee bit about what faith is and all of its connotations. So I thought I'd start with a wee quote by Christopher Hitchens, if that's okay. And Christopher Hitchens said this: "Religion is poison because it asks us to give up our most precious faculty, which is that of reason, and to believe things without evidence. It then asks us to respect this, which it calls faith." So that to give up our most precious faculty, which is reason, and to believe things without evidence. So is faith irrational? Like with what Christopher Hitchens has said there, David Glass?
Well, this is a excuse me. This is a good example of the sort of thing I was talking about with the new
Mhm.
atheists.
Absolutely.
So, when they part of the difficulty was that they make these kinds of claims that are just unsubstantiated and ironically go against all the evidence, because it's not too difficult to discover just with a little bit of looking around that if you take 2,000 years of Christianity, the idea that Christians have just got rid of the notion of reason and have sort of set aside reason is just laughable. I mean, if anything, they've gone to the other extreme. I mean, the amount of material that has been written over those 2,000 years about faith and reason and the importance of reason. I mean, there's just a huge literature on that. Now, it's a big question. What is the relationship between them and so forth? And there's different views on that, different perspectives. But all of these people are arguing for their particular viewpoint and they're setting out their case. So that there's just no grounds to this assertion that Christianity has somehow set aside reason. So and again, I suppose this, when I was looking at this in what, 2006, this is quite some time after the time I was describing earlier when I was a student and I
Mhm.
started coming across the work of Swinburne and Craig and Wright and Polkinghorne and so on. And I suppose what I tried to do in that book then was to say, well, can I draw on some of that scholarship, some of these Christian
Mhm.
philosophers, scientists, historians, and so on, to show that actually there are a lot of reasons here that Christians are certainly not setting aside reasons, but are giving good reasons for their beliefs. So, is faith irrational? Um, no, it need not be.
Mm.
I mean, this raises a question, I suppose, about what faith is. But for the new atheists, they basically define faith to be believing something, as you read from Hitchens, believing something for which there's no evidence.
Mhm.
Um, Now, sometimes people use that, right? I mean, they use faith in that sort of sense. They might have faith that they're going to win the lottery or something like that, and that is believing something for which there's no evidence. Um, but the question is, what's Christian faith? And is Christian faith believing something for which there's no evidence? And I would say no. That's just a complete misunderstanding of what Christian faith is.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. So the notion of blind faith, like, would be totally out the window for you.
Yeah, yeah, it would. So the idea of blind faith, which is what the new atheists think Christian faith is just to believe something for which there's no evidence. Now, that I suppose was the question for me as a student. Is there good evidence or good reason? I mean, let's use evidence and reason sort of together here.
Okay.
Are there good reasons for belief in God, or is it something that you have to just believe as a matter of blind faith?
Mhm.
And I suppose the more I looked into it, the more I realized, no, actually there are very good reasons and there's evidence. So for me, blind faith is not an accurate description of a Christian understanding of faith at all.
So faith, according to the Bible, is evidential. It's based on evidence. That's what you're saying.
Well, I think we need to distinguish two things here about faith or belief. So when you come to the New Testament, belief and faith just aren't distinguished from each other, really. You're
Mm.
talking about the same Greek word here. So I think it's helpful maybe to distinguish between believing that something is true and believing in something. So belief that and belief in. So the way I would put it is that when it comes to Christian faith, it involves both of these things. It's about believing that something is true about who God is, about who Jesus is, about what he has done for us. And it's about believing in him or putting our trust in him.
Mm.
So I would say the second bit is really, I suppose, at the heart of what Christian faith is, and that's about trusting in God. Now, the question is whether that trust is rational or not, whether it's reasonable to put our trust in something. And the same applies in human terms, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if you go up to the Carrick Reid rope bridge and you're going to go across, you want to know that this bridge supports is going to bear your weight when you're going across. Now, you could weigh this all up. You could get all the evidence you need. If you've got an engineer with you, maybe they'll check things out, and they'll give you all the evidence you need. So you've good grounds for believing that the bridge will indeed support you. But so far we haven't got faith. We've only got the first component, believing that it will bear your weight.
Okay.
But then the question is, are you going to actually walk across the bridge? Are you going to step on it? And that requires acting on that belief, that it supports you, trusting in it, if you like. So I would say that's more at the heart of what Christian faith is about.
I suppose that's why a lot of, like, whenever Christians talk about faith, they talk about a personal faith. So it's not just the objective belief that there is a God out there, it's them personally putting their trust in God.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's the same in human relationships as well, isn't it? You can believe something about a person, but trusting that person is another matter. And we can think about this in political terms. Do you trust politicians? We'll not get into a discussion about that. But that's something that goes beyond simply believing certain facts. It's about that sort of personal dimension to it. And I think I think that's exactly right. I think that's at the heart of what Christian faith is about, that personal trust.
Okay. And that first, like, if you think about it on that analogy of the person, like, I believe my wife exists, but I trust her implicitly.
Yeah.
And I trust her because I see the thing. I see how she looks at me, how she talks to me. I see her in her life, that she's reliable and I can trust her.
Yeah.
And that requires something personal, but it does require evidence.
It does. Although when you think about this now, I mean, I don't go around all the time sort of thinking about the evidence for whether I can trust my wife or not, right? I mean, I don't sort of sit down every day and try to weigh up the evidence and decide, should I trust my wife today or not? I don't think that would be a recipe for a good marriage. So the focus, the focus in a marriage is about the trust. So I trust my wife, and that's just something that is part of my everyday life. And so I don't sit down and talk or think about the evidence for that trust all the time. And similarly with Christians, a lot of Christians, they don't sit down and think about the evidence and the reasons for belief in God all the time. The focus for most Christians is, of course, on the personal trust. But the question then we can ask, if we step back, now let's suppose somebody says, but are there good reasons for that? Well, okay, now is the time for us to think about what the reasons are. And similarly with my wife, again, if somebody asks me, well, do you have good reasons for that? Well, now I can say, well, okay, now that you ask me, actually, yeah, I have loads of good reasons I can give you. So I think that analogy is very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful understanding what faith is. So I bumped into a guy a while ago, and one of the first things, we got chatting a wee bit about Christianity. Well, it was brought up anyway, and he said that he was an atheist because of science, and his implication, and many implications from many like leading new atheism or new atheists, is that because we have science, we don't need faith. And that they're almost, I suppose they're almost pitted as opposites. Do you think that that's legitimate, or do you think that's wrong?
Well, the way I would look at this is that we've got to look at a number of different things here. You can look at the history of this. You can look at particular areas of science or particular topics and debates and so forth. And there are questions. I mean, as I say, going back to when I was a student, I had all sorts of questions about things, and I do still have questions about some of those things. Um, so for example, we might have questions about how exactly you should interpret certain bits of the Bible that maybe seem to conflict with science. Um, but overall, I would say the picture is quite different. I would say that overall, the case from science actually for belief in God is very strong. And it's not just particular scientific findings, although that might be true as well. We can come back to that. But the very nature of science itself, I would say, is a pointer towards belief in God. If you go back to the founders of modern science, when they made their scientific discoveries, in fact, the reason many of them engaged in science in the first place was because of their belief in God, not despite it. It was precisely because they believed in a rational creator that they started to go and look for laws in the natural world. So the historian Peter Harrison has written a lot about this, and he would say that when you go back to the origins of modern science and you find this notion of a law of science. So when we think about Newton's laws, or the law of gravity and so on, well, these days we just sort of take that for granted. But when you go back to the start of science, they didn't have this notion of a law at all. That there was, of course, talk of laws, but those were usually concerned with moral laws. But these Christian thinkers now considered the universe and said, well, look, because we believe in God, and we believe in a rational world, and we believe in a lawgiver, and so we would expect to find laws describing how the world works. And so it was because of that belief in a lawgiver that many of them started to do science, seeking for those laws that God had put in place. So when they discovered the scientific laws, it didn't undermine their belief in God even slightly. In fact, quite the opposite. Now they thought, I understand something about how God has done it. I understand something about how God has made this incredible world. And so science actually gave rise to worship of God rather than in any way undermining it. And so that's the understanding, I suppose, I have come to, that really belief in God provides a very solid foundation for science, because science presupposes the fact that there is an orderly world out there that we can go out and investigate and discover.
And that's huge. Like, I remember reading that recently, just those core aspects of how we even get the scientific method, that there's an ordered and regular world, so we can do repeated experimentation. And then the idea of a mind and how we can trust our mind, because we couldn't trust our mind if it was just unguided natural forces, and all of those things that actually give rise to not just science, but the scientific method itself.
Yeah.
And even how the Bible itself is just so pro science. Even in Adam in the garden, go and explore, go name the animals, and that was really different to all of what I was hearing online. You hear the YouTube clips and all the rest, and it's just like Christians are anti-science and all this kind of, and they have been at different times and all that. But biblical Christian, the Bible's teaching on it is definitely not anti-science.
No, absolutely. I think that's right. I think it provides a foundation for doing science rather than in any way undermining it or being undermined by science. And so the idea that not only is there, as you say, this rational order in the universe, and that raises a huge question. Why is the universe like that? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any reason on a purely naturalistic viewpoint for why the universe should be that way, why it should be so rationally ordered, and furthermore, why it should be comprehensible to us humans.
Right.
Why is it that we, using these finite, limited minds of ours, are somehow able to some extent, to understand how the universe works? And
Mhm.
of course, again, I think that makes sense in the context of a biblical viewpoint that we are made in the image of God, which is an incredible thought. I mean, it really says that there is something about who we are that is made to be like God. And so using these human minds that we have, we're able to get an insight into the mind of the creator, is the way some people have put it, the way some scientists have put it. And in fact, there was this phrase, I think it goes back to Kepler, that when they were doing science, they were thinking God's thoughts after him. So, a really great motivation for doing science.
That's so helpful to hear that, even, and remind ourselves of that Christianity is not anti-science and faith is not anti-science. I've heard it said that, I think I read it in a few different areas, that in order to actually do science, you need a little faith. Would that be, would that be true, would it?
Well, no, that's a good question, and it brings us back, I suppose, to what we were saying about faith,
Yeah,
right? So, what exactly do we mean by faith? So, and so here we need to be a little bit careful. So, we want to avoid saying that in order to do science, you need to believe things for which there's no evidence, right? Because that's not what we mean by
absolutely.
faith, based on our earlier, excuse me, based on our earlier discussion. So what are we saying here? Well, I think one way of putting it, I think you've already maybe alluded to it, is the idea that there are certain presuppositions that we need in order to do science about the world out there, about its comprehensibility, about the order in it, that when we do experiments, that they're actually telling us something reliable. It's not just something that could be completely different in the future or in different parts of the universe or whatever. So there are certain underlying assumptions that are needed, and those presuppositions, I suppose you could say that those are kind of taken on trust.
Mhm.
So in that sense, I suppose you could say there is something like faith at work
Mhm.
that's needed for the foundations of science.
So Sheldon Van Auken, he wrote a class book called The Severe Mercy. It's a brilliant book. And in it, he describes himself coming to faith. He was very influenced apparently by C.S. Lewis. And he describes faith as a gap. That there is a certain stepping across. It's not blind.
Yeah.
It's not like Indiana Jones, like crossing, is it the Last Crusade? He has to do a leap of faith and he just works it up in himself and steps. It's not like that. It's not blind,
Mhm.
but there is a kind of a stepping across based on the evidence that there is there. And I suppose that is what, I don't know, like, so I'm a Bible teacher, so that's what I see in the Bible.
Yes.
I don't see blind faith. So like Abraham, like in Romans 4, when it's talking about Abraham, the Bible actually uses this word, he considered, he thought through the ramifications of it, he thought through it, and he weighed up all of the evidence in his mind and then stepped forward. And anywhere where you see faith in the Bible, it's always a response to something. It's never blind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I constantly see. And so when I'm hearing blind faith, faith without evidence, that's just contrary to what is actually said in the Bible, and it's contrary to actually my personal experience as a Christian. And
Yeah.
that's why I find it so frustrating.
Yeah.
But
No, I quite agree with you. I think that's right, and it certainly hasn't been my experience to think about faith in that sort of way at all. It is, as you say, much more um, a trust that can be based on good evidence. And I think you're right about um, the fact that there is this step of faith that is needed beyond the evidence. Um,
mhm,
and here I think it is important maybe to think about, we've been talking a bit about the nature of faith. I think it's also important to talk a little bit about the nature of evidence as well,
yeah,
because sometimes people think of evidence or reasons that somehow they have to be conclusive, that they have to absolutely 100% show that
mhm,
something is true. But actually, that's simply not the case. It's not the case in science, right? I think one of the difficulties sometimes is that people come with a very narrow conception of evidence.
yeah,
So, you might at a first attempt think about evidence as something that you can see or something you can detect with your five senses. But even in science, that's much too narrow, right? I mean, it's so you might broaden it out and say, well, it's what you can detect not only with your five senses, but with scientific equipment when you're doing your experiments. And yeah, that's a step in the right direction, but that's still too narrow because, when scientists explore a topic such as, why the dinosaurs became extinct, there's no scientific apparatus that we can go out and just do an experiment and, the pointer will go over and show, oh, here is why the dinosaurs went extinct. No, the whole process is more subtle than that. They've got to come up with hypotheses to try to explain the evidence. And whichever hypothesis does the best job of accounting for all the relevant evidence, then that evidence supports that hypothesis or theory. And so I think if we think about evidence in that broader sense, which is needed for science, actually, I think that fits with at least the way I would think about evidence when it comes to belief in God as well. We don't simply detect God with our five senses, or if you come to this discussion thinking about it like that, I mean, of course you're going to say there's no evidence for God. I don't know of any scientific experiment that is just going to give you that kind of direct scientific evidence for God. But if you think about evidence in this broader sense, does belief in God help to explain, help us to make sense of different aspects of the universe and the world we live in, then I would say that evidence can be actually very good. But again, as in the scientific context, it doesn't give us certainty. It gives us reasonable grounds for belief. And that's where I suppose that extra step of saying, well, okay, this is reasonable to believe. Am I going to act on that belief now?
Yeah, that's a good point. We can't prove God, but he definitely is the best explanation for the evidence that we see. Absolutely. So if faith, and that's what we're saying, the biblical faith, it's not blind, it's not irrational, it's actually based on a reasonable weighing up of the evidence in front of us. So let's move on to then, if faith is based on evidence, what is the evidence for a God?
Okay, yeah. So that's a great question. And I think there can be different types of evidence for God. We've already talked about some aspects of that, I suppose. So I would actually say that science itself, the whole nature of science, provides us with some evidence. In fact, I would say with good evidence for belief in God, because, excuse me, one of the things that we need to explain about the universe that we live in is this incredible order. As I said, we've already mentioned that. Why is the universe like that? If there's no God, there's no reason to expect such an orderly universe. Yet everything we know about the universe, whether it's at the large scale structure of the universe, or whether it's right down at the level of microphysics, or whether it's at the level of the cell, the incredible complexity of life, we just find order and incredible degrees of order everywhere. So I think belief in God provides the best explanation of that order. So that order would, I think, be one of the most important aspects of the evidence for God. But more specifically, I suppose a real example, a strong example of this would be the fine-tuning of the universe. So again, a very definite type of order that we have in the universe, that many features of the universe are just right for life. I think you've explored that maybe in one of your previous podcasts. But again, why is the universe like that? I think belief in an intelligent creator provides us with a very good explanation of that fine-tuning of the universe.
That's probably one of the most recognized, like there's very few scientists will actually say the universe isn't fine-tuned. And there's a lot of scientists will actually say that is one of the best evidence that pushes us toward God. And I think even Richard Dawkins recently said that on Justin Brierley's show, that it was probably one of the most convincing things that would lead him to a deist kind of God.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That fine tuning, that there are various features of our universe that are just right, a balance between fundamental forces, for example, that just needs to be right to a very precise degree of accuracy, and had it been slightly different, life wouldn't be possible. So the basic scientific facts are there. They're generally agreed upon, as you say. So there, the scientific evidence, I think, is very clear. The question then is, well, what's the best explanation of that scientific evidence? So this is where we're now broadening it out and saying, well, if we think about it, evidence, not in this very narrow sense, but this broader sense, as we talked about earlier, I would say that evidence points very strongly to an intelligent, rational creator of the universe. So that's another one. You also have the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. Now, again, these are all huge topics. You could do a podcast, and you could go and find some of the people who are the experts in all of these. And again, it's not one of proof, right? I mean, because you'll get debates within the scientific community. Did the universe really have a beginning? Was it an absolute beginning or not? I happen to think the evidence is very good that it did. And if that's where the evidence is taking us, again, I think that's, the case for belief in God is incredibly strong if that is right. I mean, if the universe had a beginning, how can it come into existence out of absolutely nothing if there's no God? I mean, that's belief in God just makes perfect sense. And that, of course, fits with the very first verse of Genesis, doesn't it? That in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. And who would have thought it would have taken to the 20th century to find actual scientific evidence for this beginning, but there it is. So there are these different lines of evidence from science, within science itself. A couple others, I'll not go on here, but I just to mention a couple of others, I think the evidence of the mind and consciousness. And here again, there is a recognition from many thinkers who don't hold a Christian belief or even a belief in God at all, that there is a non-physical dimension to the human mind and consciousness, that there's something beyond the physical. It can't be explained in purely physical terms. Now, that's a really interesting direction for non-religious thinkers to be going in. But again, I want to take a step back and say, well, hold on now, if there's a non-physical dimension to the universe we live in, does that fit better with atheism or with belief in God? I mean, it seems to me, again, the evidence is pointing towards belief in God. And also, of course, we could go to topics like morality. Where do we get our foundations for morality from? But of course, that opens up another big discussion. But again, I would say, and this is the sort of thing C.S. Lewis discussed a lot, of course, that it's really God who provides us with that sort of foundation for morality. So I think there's all sorts of pointers, but of course there are more specifically Christian ones as well. And here we would go to the person of Jesus and the evidence regarding Jesus, which we might talk about more. But also the evidence of people's own individual lives, that the experience we have. I think this is something we need to pursue and be open to that evidence of the reality of God in our lives. So you get the sort of objective evidence from science, but also perhaps this more personal evidence, if you like, from our own lives as well.
Very good. Very good. So I'm not sure if this is totally correct, but the way I understand it and the way Romans 1, 2, and 3 understands it is that the evidence from origins, cosmos and all that kind of stuff will lead us to deism. It'll lead us to think that there's something out there. The evidence from intuition, from our humanness, from our morality and things like that will lead us to theism. It'll lead us to see someone out there. But it takes a further step of revelation to bring us to Christianity. So origins leads us to deism, intuition leads us to theism, and revelation will lead us to Christianity. Now, I'm a Bible teacher, so I like quirky and good things to sit, so that might be true and it might not. But
it's certainly a very neat way of putting it. Yeah.
It seems to fit with Romans 1, 2, and 3. So definitely our intuition and the cosmos, there's definite evidence there. And I think both of us would be committed believers in God, not because of one strand of evidence, but because of the many strands of evidence that push us toward God as the best explanation. But you're not just a believer in God, and I'm not. You're a Christian. So what then takes you the further step from believing in the kind of deist God of Einstein or Richard Dawkins to, or Paul Davies as a mind, or the law behind the universe, to believing in Jesus? What brings you the further step?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, John. Maybe I can just say one thing about the evidence for God that we've talked about so far, because it applies, I think, in this case as well when it comes to considering what might be relevant in the context of Christianity. I mean, what I've been trying to say so far is that I think there is good evidence or good reasons for belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, earlier we talked a little bit about the new atheists. And I think the new atheists were very extreme in their approach. And there are many people I've met who will describe themselves as atheists or agnostics, and they're not so extreme. And so I don't want to give the impression that because somebody doesn't believe in God, it means they're stupid or something like that. I certainly don't.
Absolutely.
I don't think they're just willfully ignoring evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are huge questions about our universe that we're asking here. And so I know intelligent people who come down on different sides of these debates. What I would say is important in this context is an openness to the evidence and a desire to seek the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Because when it comes to evidence, and this is true within science as well, there's got to be an openness to the truth and to allowing the evidence to speak. Mm-hmm. And it's true in human relationships as well. We've got to be open to the truth and to seek the truth. And so that's what I suppose I would encourage people to do, is to say, well, look, maybe you don't believe in God, but go and look at the evidence again. Maybe look at some of these resources we've been talking about, investigate it, and see if with this broader concept of evidence that I've been talking about, see whether belief in God might make more sense. Now, part of the reason I mention that here is because I think this is true also when it comes to thinking about Christian belief specifically. Mm-hmm. Because it's sometimes we might give the impression, and there is a danger when we're having a discussion like this, that we can sort of resolve all of these issues by sitting down almost like scientists or philosophers and just thinking intellectually through it all and weigh up all the evidence, and that's all there is to it. But there's more going on. There's an attitude of our hearts as well, because this is not just about these external issues. It's about who we are, and it's about ultimately this faith aspect that we talked about, whether we're going to trust in God. So there's a personal response that's required on our part. And so I think for that reason, I think there needs to be a willingness not only to investigate the truth, but to be changed by it. Because after all, if there is a God, I suspect very strongly that God's primary interest is not us getting all of these factual beliefs about the existence of God and about how it relates to science. Mm-hmm. I strongly suspect, and of course it's the Christian belief, that if there is a God, then what God is interested in is our transformation. It's to make us into the kinds of people that he has designed us to be. So when it comes to thinking about the Christian aspect of this, I think we have to be open to the fact that not only are we investigating truth claims, but we're investigating who we are and our place in the universe, and whether there might be a purpose for our lives, and whether God might want us to live our lives a particular way. And I think if we come to it with that with that sort of framework in mind, or that sort of perspective, I think we can open our thinking to consider the evidence in light of that. And when we do that, I suppose there's a couple of things that I would mention here. First of all, does the Bible itself and the teaching and the ideas in the Bible make sense of who we are as human beings? And I think it does. I think it makes an awful lot of sense in terms of the fact that we have this idea of who we should be, of what we should be like as human beings, and yet the fact that we individually and collectively fall incredibly short of that standard. It's as if there is a way things are meant to be, and yet it's not the way they are. And the Bible explains this as to why that's the case, why things have gone wrong, if you like. But secondly, and perhaps more fundamentally, is to look at the person of Jesus, because of course, when it comes to Christianity, Christ is obviously at the center of the whole thing. So we've got to look at him. We've got to look at his life. We've got to look at the evidence for that. Here, I mean, this is again a huge topic, and we won't have time to go into it in detail. But let me put it like this: when I was writing the book that you mentioned earlier, I thought, well, on the scientific front, this is okay. I think there's good evidence here, and we can make the case for belief in God. But what about these central claims of Christianity, about the life of Jesus, and in particular about the death and resurrection of Jesus? Is this not just something we believe, by revelation, and that's it? You sort of either believe it or you don't. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that no, really you can go and investigate the historical evidence. And when you do this, you find that it's not simply a matter of taking the Bible at face value, but you can go and you can ask your questions. You can scrutinize what it's saying. You can scrutinize these claims about Jesus of Nazareth, about his life, about his death, about the events that occurred after his death. And it turns out there's really good evidence to establish various claims about what happened. And I would say that when, again, you approach this and say, well, what's the best explanation of all of this? I would say that the best explanation is that the central claims of Christianity are in fact true. So, I mean, that's maybe a long-winded answer to your question, but it's to suggest that, the evidence is there, and it's something just that needs to be explored with the right mindset and an openness to seek the truth.
No, I think that's really helpful. It definitely is, because where we come to in our abilities to believe, a lot of the time are determined not just by intellect, but it's by experience, it's by upbringing, by trauma in our life, and all of those kind of things that can put us off. And I totally agree. The majority of people probably I meet who don't believe in God, it's not because of intellectual reasons. It's genuinely because of something else that's happened in a life. And you're absolutely right to raise that belief goes beyond, in a sense, that intellectual evidence to the whole of the being. And that just makes sense, because it's the whole of us that God wants in a relationship to trust him. And that makes total sense. Yeah. Listen, that's very helpful today. Just to finish, Dr. Glass, if someone is listening to this and is going, right, okay, I probably need to start investigating even the person of Jesus, or investigating this, where would you tell them to start? Where would you tell them to look for the evidence?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good resources on this. I think one of the places that you do need to start with is looking at the gospel accounts within the Bible itself. Now, if somebody's coming to the gospel, I'm not saying that you simply go and read this and just accept this as the word of God. You take that blind leap of faith. I'm not saying that, but I think what you can do, I think somebody who's looking for the truth, they can go and read those gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, and do it with an open mind. Indeed, I think it makes perfect sense for somebody to pray and ask God, if you're there, to reveal your truth to me as I read this, and to do it with an open mind. But also, don't set aside your questions either. It's not, just either or. You can come to the Bible, you can read it with an open mind, and you can ask your questions as well, and go and look at some of the resources to try to get answers to those questions. Various resources available on this, on the evidence for the the historical claims concerning the person of Jesus. People like William Lane Craig on his site Reasonable Faith, various resources by somebody like N.T. Wright, I think here would be very helpful, and plenty of other online resources as well that people can go to. I'm sure you'll be able to point them in that direction as well. So I would encourage people to investigate those things and to do it with that open mindset, asking God to reveal His truth to them as they do so, and that, as the Bible says elsewhere, that if you seek the truth, you'll find it. So that I suppose would be the direction I would point people in. And I think one of the things to keep central, though, is the purpose of the exercise is not primarily, the focus is not, I want to go and try to prove that the Bible's true or prove that the Bible's false. The key and central question is to go and see, who's Jesus? Who is this Jesus? And are these claims that the Christians are making about him right? Did he live the life that is described in the Bible? Was he crucified? Did he rise from the dead? So keep the focus on Jesus, and on these things that are really central to what Christianity is all about.
Very good. I've heard of a website as well, Saints and Skeptics, might be of help as well.
Well, I don't know that I would put that top of the list, but there might be the odd thing there that would be worth searching up on it and seeing if you can find something relevant.
Very good. Well, listen, Dr. Glass, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to be with us today. And thank you for listening as well. If you do have any questions or comments, or even what we're talking about today, if you would like to know anything further, please do get in contact with us. At the moment, we're out around the city giving out Gospels of Mark. If you would want one of them, please get in contact with us, and we'd love to give you one free of charge. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening.